Hello, everybody. My name's Ernie Broughton. I'm a senior advisor with the Ethics and Compliance Initiative. I want to welcome you to ECI's October Best Practice Forum, Innovations in E&C Risk Management. We've got a great program for you. We're going to be hearing from AT&T, Eli Lilly, FTI Consulting, Navex Global, and we've got a fully packed schedule, and so we'll get started in just a moment. Just a few logistics. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors of this forum, FTI Consulting and Navex Global. A couple of other items that relate to your engagement in today's session. Please use the chat box and let us know where you're calling in from. And see who else is in the forum today, who you might know. Secondly, please use the polls tab if you have questions for our presenters, and we will get to as many of the questions as we have time for. And before leaving, we'd appreciate you taking a quick survey to give us feedback on what worked for you today and how this could be even more effective for you, how we can serve you as members and practitioners. There is a files tab for resources that have been provided by the presenters. So go to the files tab, look under resources to access those. And there is a poll that we would appreciate you answering, and it has to do with your engagement plans for 2022. We have a great schedule of programs that we're building out for you. We'd like to know how you'd like to receive those, whether you would prefer live on-site meetings, whether you prefer virtual, regional, local. We need your feedback, so please do respond to that poll. And so let's go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to have with us as our first presenter, Michael Bridwell. He is an advisor with Eli Lilly in Ethics and Compliance. And Michael is going to give us a level set in terms of risk management in the ethics and compliance space. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Ernie. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to the group today, and I appreciate you giving me this time and allowing me to share kind of how we run our local risk assessment process on a global basis. And I hope to be able to share as we go through this some of the tools and techniques that we utilize, and hopefully you'll see that they're simple and practical yet effective. So with that, let me see here. There we go. Our process, you can kind of think about it in five key components. We start by setting expectations with our various leaders. We prepare for a workshop that we run within each of everywhere where we have an ethics compliance officer. We run this process, and like I said, we run it annually. And with it, we run a workshop, and I'll get into kind of the details around that. And then we support our business leaders as they work on their mitigation plans for the prioritized risks that come out of that workshop. And then we have follow-up that we establish that gives us the opportunity to make this an ongoing activity and not just a one and done type of event. So with that, in setting expectations, we start by defining what we mean by an E&C related risk, and I provide that definition to our ethics compliance officers. And we always want to start by having a conversation with whether if it's an affiliate, a GM leader, our general manager, or a functional leader. We want to sit down with them and have a conversation and make sure that they are supportive of this process. And we've been doing this for a number of years now, and fortunately, we've got strong support across the enterprise for this activity. The business sees a lot of value in it, and we don't take that for granted, but it definitely makes this go a lot easier when we have their support. And what we need from them is not only their engagement, but one of the key things that we do is we need them to assign the prioritized risks that come out of the workshop to members of their lead team and not to the ethics compliance officer. Our ethics compliance officers will help and partner, but we need the business to own these risks and drive the associated mitigations. From a time commitment perspective, we have interviews with the leadership, and then the workshop in and of itself is typically anywhere from an hour to 2 hours in time limit. And then we want to have the right mindset. And this is where, we want to come together as a unified team. We ask people to kind of take off their functional hats and look at this activity from a team mindset. And when you do that right and you do it well, it sends a broader message to the organization. It lets the organization know that number one, their leaders care. They're set aside time to identify and work together those risks that have the greatest impact on their business objectives. And then they put resourcing and people behind it to mitigate those risks. And so that the employees know that then they have confidence that in those areas where the business is headed, that the business is working diligently to mitigate the risks so that they can do their jobs and do it effectively. And this is kind of a high level of kind of the pre-work activity, and I'll get into some of the details. But we start by, I pulled together a group of people where we provide central data to our ethics compliance officers. And I'll just cover a couple of things. We make sure that we provide the themes that our corporate audit service group is seeing as they've done audits over the last 12 to 18 months. We also make sure that they have access to their monitoring data and their investigation data, as well as what we're seeing from an anti-corruption due diligence perspective. We also we've started our journey on data analytics, and we provide information around transfer of value to our ECHOs. And then we also highlight for them what we're seeing from a privacy perspective, what we're seeing from an external enforcement perspective, as well as what are some of the key risks from an information security area. And all of that, I encourage our ethics compliance officers to look at that data through the lens of their business plan. They need to understand where the business is going, what are the business objectives, and then look at that data through that lens. Because you could have, hundreds of risks, but you want to identify those risks that are going to have the greatest impact on your objectives. And so that carries into, when you look at the external environment, what's changing in the space that you're going to be playing in your next year, as well as what's going on inside the business that's changing. And I'm a big believer, wherever there's change, that's where there's opportunities for risk. And then I'm a big believer in follow the money. And I encourage folks to really understand where their business is placing their bets. Because where they're doing that, that's where their focus and attention is going to be, and that's where the greatest opportunity for risk are going to be. And then they conduct interviews, and I'll get into kind of what that looks like here in a minute. And then they take all that information, and my encouragement to them is to come up with kind of 10 to 15 risks that they want to take into their workshop. And we'll talk about that here in a minute, what that can look like. From a detailed perspective, I provide them a simple some messaging that they can copy and paste and send out to their lead teams to kind of kick off this process. I also provide them guidance on how to conduct their interviews. I also encourage them to take that data that we were just talking about and just as an example, let's say they're talking to their head of sales, to kind of take the objectives, what that leader is trying to accomplish in the coming year, take all that data and say, as I look at this data, here are some key risks that I see that I think impact you. And have that discussion and say, does that make sense? So that when you walk out of that meeting, you've got a more refined risk that leader sees in their business. And it just helps you to refine that activity. And then from there, after we've done our interviews, I also encourage them to identify those people in the business that are kind of in the heart of the business, that have been there for a long time, that have the respect of their business colleagues, that really know how things work. And I encourage them to sit down with them and ask them where they're feeling pressure, where they see pressure in the system. And that's a key nugget of information that they can pull out to also highlight, potential risks for a given affiliate or function. this is one of the tools that we created a few years ago, and one of my colleagues says this is kind of where the magic happens. It's very simple, but it really does work, and it gets to how we craft our risk statements. And one of the things that we started several years ago was to get people to focus in on root cause. And as you can imagine, in ethics compliance, root cause takes, it starts here in your risk assessment, but it carries through all the activities. When you monitor and you find an issue, you got to get to the root cause of that so that you can put an effective CAPA in place. And so it's just a natural way to think about things, and it supports everything that we do within ethics compliance. And what we have simplified this to is we get people to start with the question, do I have effective oversight for this area that I'm concerned about? And if it's process related, do I have an effective process? Can that process be executed? Is it repeatable? Is it people dependent? A lot of processes are dependent on that person running it, and when they leave, it falls apart because there's not good process documentation in place. And so, I encourage our folks to kind of start and ask those 3 questions before they ever get to training, or ultimately that somebody just is not doing their job. But if I ever hear the words retraining at first, I always encourage them to kind of move back up the chain. And so when they use this tool, every risk statement we write says there is a risk that, and then we link that the risk to the root cause by saying because, and then ultimately you've got to be able to demonstrate how this risk has an impact on the business. If you can't do that, then you're kind of wasting your time at that point. And we do that by using phrases such as leads to, causing, and results in, and as opposed to might, may, or could, because they are more action oriented and they drive the right attention and focus and ownership from the business. And so this is the tool that we use, and I hope for those on the call that find this beneficial. And then I've not filled this all out, but in our groups I do, but you'll get the sense of how I use this. And I just used this year, and our ethics compliance officers have found this really beneficial. So I took a risk statement, a real risk statement that we had, and this is the process that I go through when people submit them to me for review. The first thing I ask is, what is the risk? And I write that out. And then I ask myself, why is it happening? What's the root cause? And I draft that. And then I start to say, have we asked enough questions for this root cause? And what we like to employ is the 5 whys. Why is this happening? In a lot of cases, some people do this really well, and some people are still learning in this journey. And to kind of support what I just showed you in the previous slide, I've started to ask questions like, do we have the right oversight? Is the review process that is involved in this, simple and consistently followed? Is the process clearly documented? And then are people trained on the process, and do they understand the key requirements? And I can pull those things out, and it really helps our ethics compliance officers really understand better and get and have a better position to be able to articulate ultimately what the root cause is. And why it's so important then is if you really have done this well, it sets up our business partners to do a really nice job of building a mitigation plan that actually has a high probability of success going forward. And so talk about the workshop. So one of the things that like I said at the beginning, I encourage them to bring 10 to 15 risks into that workshop. And here it says no more than 20. And there's kind of 2 ways that I encourage them to do this. The first is that I encourage them to take the risk that they think a member of the lead team is going to be the owner of, and sit down with them and walk them through the data and the information that they utilize to craft that risk statement, and see if they understand it and see if they agree with it. And if they do, then ask them to come to the meeting and do what you just did with them. And I have found that creates a lot more ownership in the risk when you do it that way. And I've found that it drives the discussion in a much more robust manner. On the flip side, you can, depending on if you've been there a long time and you have a lot of trust in the group, You can just bring them all together, share that information with everyone, and then go through the process. We use a 3x3 risk grid. We have a common likelihood and impact rating scale, and then we have you can just have everyone kind of put the risks up onto the grid. They both work, but I have found that the first methodology works best from creating the right ownership and the right level of attention that I think is necessary in this process. And so ultimately, at the end of the workshop, our goal is to walk away with our top 3 to 5 risks, to have the business leader assign those risks to members of that lead team, give them about 30 days to start to work on to build their mitigation plan. The ethics and compliance officer supports them in that process. And at the same time they're doing that, our ethics and compliance officers then start working on their monitoring plan, using these risks as kind of their key focus areas. We also provide kind of a central view of key risk activities that they also build into their monitoring plan. And then they build their communication and training plan all around those risk activities. So that when we come back from the holidays in January, they can build all that information into our central database, and they basically have their plan going forward. And this is another tool that I've created that our folks have found really beneficial for enabling the business to actually start to build these mitigation plans. And it's simply as simple as you put your risk statement, you pull out what the root cause and what the effect on the business is, and you ask them to then fill out the mitigations and to ask themselves, do those mitigations address the root cause? And the answer is no, to keep working at it. Similarly, are the measures that we've identified showing an impact on the root cause? And do we have a clear implementation date? And do we have a clear owner? And if they can answer yes to all of those, they've got a great start. And if it's no, we want to keep working at it. But it's a simple tool, but it's an effective tool. And then finally, from a follow-up perspective, on a quarterly basis at a minimum, we have a kind of a common deck that all of our ethics compliance officers use to give an update on how things are going in the business from an ethics compliance standpoint. We update how we're doing in our monitoring, how CAPAs are coming along, if there have been any investigations, what's going on in the external environment. We highlight that for the business. And then at the same time, we bring those business leaders in who have been working on their mitigations and have them give an update to show how they are progressing. And all of this is intended to work together. And it allows us to kind of continue that dialogue and continue that focus on those prioritized risks so that we're mitigating those and enabling the business to move forward to achieve their objectives. And ultimately, that's how we do it. And I hope you found this beneficial, and I'll now turn it back over to you, Ernie, and see if we got any questions and have our little opportunity for some questions and answers. Okay. Great.
Thank you so much, Michael. And so we do have, let's see here. If it's possible, let's have you all write in your questions, and I'll start the process here with Michael. And it sounds kind of basic in terms of where to start on this, Michael, but you talked about defining for people what E&C risk is. Mm-hmm. That's not always self-evident. How do you work with people in terms of defining what E&C risk is as opposed to other kinds of risk?
So in general, we kind of focus people in on kind of 3 key things. How and where we spend our money, how we communicate externally, because most of what we do is with healthcare providers, and we're communicating to them our medicines, and then privacy. It's critically important, whether it be in a clinical trial or with an HCP that may be a speaker for us. To maintain the privacy of that information is critical for us to kind of be in the business that we're in and continue to operate the way we want to operate. We've got to maintain people's privacy. So those are kind of the 3 main areas where these risks fall into.
Well, that's very helpful. How does the E&C risk management process compared to ERM as a whole? How does it
Okay.
align? Because do you have responsibilities
I
in
do.
terms of the overall
I
ERM
do.
program?
I do. Yep.
So
I
talk to us a
run.
little bit about how those intersect.
Yeah, so our ERM program is aligned to the strategic plan, and our local risk assessment is aligned to the business plan. So ERM looks at the next 5 years, business plan looks at the next year. ERM looks at all types of risk. Our local risk assessment looks at those risks that are for the most part, ethics compliance related risks. And our local risk assessment process is a key control to a risk that we have on our ERM grid. And so it filters up, kind of ladders up into to that risk that's on our ERM grid. So they're kind of complementary of each other. But that's kind of we run them really the similar ways. We have workshops that we run at an ERM level in the company. But we're doing that at the time we're doing our strategic planning exercise, whereas the workshops that we do from the local risk assessment, we do as we bring our business plan to a close. So those are kind of the high level, those are some of the differences and similarities of both processes.
And so let's see, we have a question here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm waiting for a question to come in. Okay. All right, here it comes. Do you use a tool to help teams identify compliance risks, or is it more of a brainstorm and an interview approach alone?
So I talked about how we provide that central data. And so that is a starting point for our ethics compliance officers. And like I mentioned, we've just started our journey down this path of data analytics, and we have a tool that gives each of our ethics compliance officers visibility into things such as transfer of value information, so that they can identify outliers, they can identify trends, all of that information they utilize in addition to the interviews to guide them in this process.
Great, thank you. Got another question here from our audience. Can you share how many people are involved in the workshops and how long the process takes from start to finish? And I'm assuming we're talking about like the, probably from a couple of things, I guess, the process of the workshops from start to finish, and also your ERM, ENC exercise. Is that ongoing on a continuous basis? Maybe both of those things.
Sure. So from a local risk assessment, we kick it off in September. That's when our business planning process starts. The majority of the effort is in that pre-work where the ethics compliance officers are identifying the risk. And I would say that that's anywhere from 20 to 40 hours of their time to do that right. The workshop itself has anywhere from 5 to 10 people in it. Like I said, it usually is about an hour. Sometimes it goes for 2 hours. When we first started this, some of them went actually 4 hours because the lead team was so enthralled in the information that they were seeing that they hadn't seen that before. But we've gotten a lot better at it and more efficient at it. So it's usually about an hour to 2 hours. From the ERM perspective, we do our interviews throughout the month of January. We run our workshops in February and March. And that allows us then to update our corporate risk grid kind of in the April timeframe. And then kind of in the May, June, we update our risk mitigation plans, and then we give a report out to the board in August. It's kind of at a high level. That's kind of how we run that play.
And is it just, how many people are actually on your team to help administer the program and manage the program?
So it's managing the program is really just me.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But I have, from an ERM perspective, I have what we call our ERM liaison. So I have a point person in each of our business units that helps me facilitate this work. And then from the local risk assessment, I have our echoes, and there's probably about, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 60 echoes that run the process. So hopefully that gives you kind of a reference.
It does. is that recognized in their performance appraisals then, the role
Yes.
that they play in risk?
Yes, yes, it
Yeah,
is.
so there's accountability built into that. And I know too that just something I wanted to kind of call out here is that you do have project management background and PMI certification. Do you? And I know that Eli Lilly places a lot of value on having project management certifications. Would you recommend that that probably is kind of an entry skill set that every program should be looking at in terms of building in to their ERM program?
Well, I'm sure it depends, but from my perspective, I think it's invaluable. And so, you know, I just think it makes it easier to do this job, to have those skill sets, because it's like running a major project, you know, every year. And so having that understanding, appreciating kind of the key deliverables and key inputs and those types of things just, you know, makes you more effective. And your customers that you're giving information to appreciate it a lot more. And so it's kind of a win-win. So from that perspective, it's a great thing and it's a valuable thing, but ultimately it's going to be, you know, dependent on the group and the people that are running it. But those are valuable tools to have in your toolbox.
Yeah, well, I would agree. Another question we have is that there's an evolution in organizations and E&C functions about how they relate to ESG efforts that are taking hold in their companies. How are ESG activities or risks integrated into your ERM model?
So I can just we have a team that we just created last year that has responsibility for ESG. A colleague of mine that helps me with our annual interviews from an ERM perspective is our point person from E&C on that team. And so that gives us that direct linkage to the work that they're doing. We share with them our corporate risk grid and our risk mitigation so that they have visibility into that. But we're just at the early stages. I believe it's going to continue to evolve and we'll get more and more integrated with one another. But that's kind of how we've started.
Great, thank you. Can you share more? This is another question. This everybody's kind of blowing up the question here, so we're getting to a lot of interest that folks have. Can you share a little bit more about the data journey you mentioned and how you're linking all the hard data together? And I did have a question about that too. Like, do you have that expertise that is built into the E&C team, or is that something that you leverage through another part of the organization?
Yeah, so we brought in a kind of a top finance talent into our group, into E&C, and he has worked to build a team of experts, of data experts that have partnered. We have a whole data analytics organization at Lilly, and our group has partnered with them to build what we call a data lake, so that we have access to all of the data across the enterprise. And then this local team has been building the tools that pull from that data lake and give us access and visibility into key insights into that data. But like I said, we've been at it now for about 3 years, but we're still learning. I wouldn't say that we've mastered this at all, but we are, you know, we're getting better, and but I still think we have a ways to go in this area.
Can you give some examples of compliance risks that are identified?
Well, sure. In our area, you know, one key risk is in you know, our interactions with speakers, and there's you know, speakers want to have ownership, and so they like to change their slides, and they like to change them at the last minute. And our processes require that you at least give them to us within 5 days of the meeting so that we can run them through all of our review processes, because we've got to make sure there's not off-label information in there. We've got to make sure that it's balanced. There's all kinds of rules that go along that. And that's a key risk for us because, we need those HCPs. We want them to have ownership in the process, but we also need them to recognize, that we have certain rules and regulations that we have to follow, and those are critical to us to be able to continue to operate in the space like we want to.
Yeah, and that kind of relates to a companion question here that came out. How do your compliance risks link back to legislation, and how is this link documented? Because what you really were talking about was regulatory requirements. Yep. And pending legislation, I guess, and new legislation, and I guess you work closely with your governmental affairs.
Yeah, we do, and we try to, in general, start with our procedures. Our procedures are aligned to the external requirements and regulations, and where we have specific local code requirements, those are built into our procedures. And so we look through that lens of those procedures to guide us in the identification of those risks and where there may be issues.
What's the highest level that the E&C risks get reported to? So this is kind of on, reporting processes for leadership. I assume, do they go to the C-suite? Do they go to the board? Both? And what about hotline reports? Do those get reported to the board level?
They do. There's a process that hotline goes through, and there's a group of our senior most executives that review that information, and that gets put into our annual state of compliance report. Similarly, for the local risk assessment work that we do, that gets added to our annual state of compliance. It gets reported to the board on an annual basis. We also have reporting to what we call our Compliance and Enterprise Risk Management Committee. That's basically our executive committee plus a few special guests, and they see this information on a regular basis as well.
Great. I have kind of a final question here. That's
okay.
Pretty much what had come through. Do you think that there's value, Michael, in organizations taking a look at not just the risks that they think are going to happen, but the risks that actually did materialize, and kind of backtrack into figuring out, did we see this coming? Why didn't we see this coming? Is that part of the process?
Yes, and that's why I highlighted kind of our monitoring data as well as investigation data that we start with. Those are key things that have happened. But I encourage them to look at those things through that lens of business plan, because you may have an activity that happened, but we're not in that space any longer. So, there may be some learning, but I'd rather you focus your attention on where we actually did have a finding in a space where you're headed next year, and understand why it happened. Make sure you got to the root cause of that, and the CAPA that you put in place is addressing the issue. And if it's not, then from my perspective, you probably haven't gotten to the real root cause, and you need to dig a little deeper. And you've got to build a mitigation plan then to support and work on getting to that root cause. So yes, we do that. Similarly, pulling in the corporate audit services data where they're seeing issues across the enterprise. Those are things that have happened, and we try to understand what's the root cause behind those and why are they happening, and build that into our processes as well.
Well, thank you for that. It's obvious that you really have a world-class program there, and it's firmly rooted in a growth mindset, learning. And that's what, to me, risk management is really all about, is how do we not only anticipate, but how do we learn? And yet you have so many practical approaches and tools that I think were useful for people at any size and maturity level in their company. And so congratulations on having a great program. And we're just so grateful that you came to share this with our community of practice. I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you. And so now we will move on to our next presentation. A little bit of a different look and view here, and that's AT&T. And AT&T has developed an agile approach, because we have these annual programs in place, but also how do we maintain agility to focus on the things that are emerging in the moment, and factor those back into the process. And so we're very pleased to have two folks from AT&T to visit with us today Lisa Shepard Davenport, who's the director of the program office in the chief compliance office at AT&T, and also Oleg Vassilyev, who is the director of technology in the chief compliance office. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Ernie. And hello, everyone. I think I am experiencing technical difficulties, so my apologies if I do not appear on screen, but my colleague Oleg is sharing our presentation. And so what I'd like to do is Oleg and I are going to provide you some insight into how we've taken the concept of IT agile methodology and applied it to our risk assessment process at AT&T. We'll start with a grounding on the agile methodology as it applies to technology projects, then talk a bit about how we have embedded that logic into the AT&T compliance cycle. We'll walk you through the components of our risk assessment cycle, which we refer to as the golden thread, and discuss how we've made our annual risk assessment cycle more nimble by infusing an agile approach. Lastly, we'll discuss some of the business benefits we've realized as a result of this refreshed approach, and then speak to how we inspire intentional integrity in our compliance program by placing an emphasis on the business owning compliance from the top down and the bottom up. So now I'll turn it over to Oleg to provide an overview of the IT Agile process and the principles associated with that methodology.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, to help us understand the value of Agile and what Agile is, let's compare it to the waterfall methodology. In waterfall, first of all requirements for the work to be done are gathered. This baseline set of requirements is used to drive a sequential series of activities with controlled outputs. Next, a design is created based on those requirements, and the design is then translated into technical specifications. Once the development of all the specifications are completed, that work is then tested to confirm. The functionality is delivered back to the client as a completed product at the end of the life cycle. So if you take a look at that image on your screen on the left side, you'll see how everything is dependent, and waits until the other step is complete. In contrast, the Agile development method is based on iterative and incremental development. Agile repeats the series of discovery, design, develop, and test in short cycles, and delivering functionality and value incrementally over multiple